Today, we're dissecting the political tension of feudalism so you can add intrigue to your RPGs on this episode of Dungeon Masterpiece. Good evening, Dungeon Masters. I'm Baron Durab. You know, a lot of people have this romanticized view of feudal Europe, and we haphazardly transplant that onto our D&D games. But that does a whole lot of disservice to this system of government and to our game sessions. There is a lot of political intrigue and tomfoolery that can be had if we better understand how the system of government works and what ways it's similar to modern institutions. So let's break down feudalism and see what it really meant to be the king. Let's compare this to something we're hopefully more familiar with, the American federal government. Now hold on there, I know what you're thinking. The king is supposed to be the supreme executive, and to be frank, that's always their goal. But until certain technological advancements, namely gunpowder and artillery, gave a royal ability to exert direct control over their castle-dwelling nobility, it was those nobles who had any real authority. Nobles were considered to be the true ruler of the land. They collected taxes from their serfs and any residing freemen and used those taxes to provide welfare for their subjects. This could include maintaining roads, training soldiers for defense, repairing fortifications, or anything else. Nobles had a lot of freedom to collect taxes, and this could lead to problems. Some of the taxes went to welfare, some to the noble themselves, some to their regent or king, and another portion would be tithed to the church. Greedy nobles knew that every penny spent on the welfare of their hold meant fewer pennies for their own coffers. Nobles liked to be rich, and a particular unscrupulous baron or count might tax their hold so fiercely it could cause an uprising or revolt. Okay, so let's compare nobility to a position of the United States president. Just like the nobility, they serve as commander-in-chief of the military and collect and spend taxes. Even more similarly, nobles might delegate portions of these duties to various vassals who would become their noble court. Again, this is no different than a president appointing members of cabinet to oversee similar offices, like an attorney general or a secretary of state. So, what were the noble titles, and how could one become a noble with all this perceived power? There were a few ways it could be done, but the most common way was to fight valiantly on the battlefield while in service of a regent. Only a king or other royal could elevate someone to nobility. This honor would typically be rewarded to the most decorated veterans of a military campaign. Once achieved, these noble titles were passed by heredity. Once you became a noble, your descendants would also have the title thenceforth. The title also came with it a hold, the land in which the noble was the lord of. This is why military service was the most likely path to nobility. Knights, barons, and counts would die in battle, land would be conquered, and the king would need new nobles as replacements for tax collection. You know, this kind of reminds me of this one sci-fi movie.
Join the mobile infantry and save the world. Service guarantees citizenship.
Huh. Anyway, noble titles were awarded based on two things: the value of the military service and the value of the land which they would become the noble of. The more noteworthy the deeds and the more valuable the land, the higher the rank of nobility. Other ways to become a nobility arose due to shrewd diplomacy and mercantile practices. Kings would sometimes need to sell noble titles to wealthy merchants in order to raise money for military campaigns, or shrewd diplomats would negotiate for titles as a writer of a trade deal or treaty, much the same way a lobbyist might negotiate an exception to a new law for their corporate interests. The lowest rank of nobility, knight, would likely have little more than a few hectares and a tiny farmstead in his hold, while counts would have regions the size of, well, a county. While there are exceptions to this rule, the order of magnitude among noble titles are as follows: knight, baron, count, and margrave. In some cases, the next two titles, prince and duke, were also nobility, but they could also be received as royalty with Similar function to a king, it just depends. Once you had a noble title, you were allowed to buy, sell, and barter land to expand your sphere of influence. For example, for 800 years, my ancestors, the House of Rop, traded and gambled their way into owning almost a quarter of modern-day Lithuania before the Soviet invasion of '39, when they lost everything. So what else was this title for? A noble rank served to create a formal pecking order in a royal court, but this formality was usually ignored once a noble's skills and education were known. Therefore, it was entirely possible for an extremely wealthy and powerful baron to defer in court to a near penniless buffoon of a count who had mismanaged his inheritance and angered his serfs. Quest hook, anyone? Now, this deference would only exist in the courts of the realm, however. No noble could go to another noble's hold and make demands due to their rank. Doing something like this would, at best, start lawsuits in the court, or at worst, start a war. Royalty held large swaths of land, much the same way nobles did, but their authority didn't come from collecting taxes directly from serfs. It came from nobles swearing oaths of allegiance to the crown. Kings were the living, breathing manifestation of a treaty organization, much like treaties that created NATO or the Warsaw Pact. Royalty directed nobles who had sworn fealty to pay them taxes and to raise armies whenever the kingdom came under threat. They could also enact laws about how taxes could be collected, how noble titles could be transferred to offspring, how new nobles could be appointed, or any other various intra-kingdom concerns. This lawmaking power is why royals believed they had the divine right to rule. This could also lead to problems. Kings could create absurd tax structures and bankrupt their nobility, or on his deathbed, radically alter the peerage or succession laws and appoint a bastard son as king. That could never kick off a war, right? As it goes with our modern Senate and Congress, creating a law that was wildly unpopular with the sitting executive would result in a veto. If a majority of nobles thought the law was unfair or unjust, it could be sometimes impossible for a king to see it fully enacted. Royal titles generally only include emperor and king, but depending on the reason for the season, duke or prince were also royal titles sometimes. It's messy. So, how did you become king? Easy. You proclaim yourself king. Nope, that's really it. Now, once you're king, the next step is to have enough political finesse and military might to get other nobles to swear fealty to you. After that, it's just a matter of surviving the Game of Thrones long enough to collect taxes. All those other royals who were receiving taxes from the nobles you just stole from them might be rather upset about their sudden loss of income. One of the ways you could sometimes get away with this was to create a royal title for yourself while somehow making it appear a lesser title than a nearby king. This is how titles like Archduke got created. In the United States, the Supreme Court uses the Constitution to decide which laws and activities are legal or illegal. But in feudal Europe, this role was split between a regent's or noble's court and the Holy Roman Church and her priesthood. While the noble's court handled most everything secular, it was the priest's job to interpret the Holy Bible for its holy legal wisdom. Priests were ever vigilant to ensure serfs were treated fairly per the scripture, while noble's court oversaw business contracts and trade deals. Monks were responsible for the documentation of anything that pertained to people's culture or heritage. The church was then paid for their services with tithing. This was basically the same as taxation, but by calling it something different, it meant the church could also get kings to pay taxes. Now, if a royal or noble did something the church didn't like, the church had the authority to excommunicate them, barring them from confession or taking communion, and thus damning their soul to purgatory. It was no secret the church had money to spend, and if your behavior was less than pious or holy, the church might very well endorse holy judgment against you. Keep in mind, there was seldom any separation of church and state, so it was quite normal for nobility to take positions within the church. This was a useful tactic to climb the social ladder among lesser nobility. A simple knight might find their way into a bishopry and demand higher tithing of nobles who far outranked them, lest they be excommunicated. Even better if the new bishop had dirt on a noble. Being friends of the church got you access to lots and lots of money. But of course, this occasionally leads to issues. The whole reason the Anglican Church exists was because King Henry VIII wanted the church to allow him to divorce without excommunication. And don't even get me started on the whole Duke Frederick of Swabia appointing his own anti-pope so he could proclaim himself Holy Roman Emperor. So in closing, I hope you learned something about the power dynamics of feudalism and how they can add political tension to your game. Think of the ways the tension between these three government powers can go horribly wrong, and you'll have some makings of solid quest hooks. Are the serfs about to burn down the manor because the knight refuses to pay masons to repair the well? Does the church have a document that could call into question the legitimacy of a count's title? These are just a couple of quest hooks I can think of off the top of my head, but tell me in the comments, what would you change in the standard baseline of feudalism in your game world? Do you even use it? Until next time, Dungeon Masters, good night.